Hey guys, tonight we're going to travel back to a time when vegetables were not just misunderstood, they were downright snubbed by society's fanciest eaters. Imagine walking into a grand medieval feast, golden goblets, clinking roast boar, glistening with honey and cloves, and somewhere in the corner, a lonely dish of boiled cabbage. Untouched. That's not just garnish. That's a class statement. Before you settle in, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the content here. And don't forget to comment where you're watching from and what time it is, where you are. We're building a sleepy little time-traveling community here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, there you are, standing at the edge of a long candlelit hall in a stone-walled manor somewhere in Burgundy. The air is thick with the scent of roasted game and beeswax. A lute gently plucks in the background and everyone's wearing too many layers. You tiptoe closer to the feasting table and what you see is meat. Meat on platters, meat in pies, meat stuffed inside other meats. There's a curious-looking bird reassembled to look alive. But you're not here for meat, are you? Are you? You're here for the tragic tale of the vegetable. Let's start with something simple. Carrots. You might think of them as harmless, friendly, crunchy things. But in the Middle Ages, they were orange wasn't even standard yet. Many carrots were purple, yellow, or white. But more importantly, they were lowly. They grew underground close to dirt, suspicious, earthy. In fact, the closer a plant was to soil, the more likely it was to be considered base or unclean. Root vegetables, working class. Above-ground plants, slightly better but still not elite. By now, you may have guessed the pattern. The higher you were in the social hierarchy, the higher your food needed to grow. Coincidence hardly. You eat like your class depends on it. And in this case, it really does. Let's float over to the other side of the table. Careful, don't knock over that jug of mead and find the one sad dish of greens. It's spinach. Poor thing. Wilted, soggy, no dressing, no croutons, no Instagram filter to save it. It was probably boiled. And not because people liked it that way, but because boiling was the safest bet. This was before refrigeration, before standardized hygiene, and frankly before seasoning was democratic. Now let's pause a moment for a well-deserved tangent. Did you know that in some noble households, servants were instructed to pre-chew certain herbs for their lords? Yes, not quite kissing, not quite salad, prep something in between. Parsley was the original breath mint, but not if you were a count. Anyway, back to the spinach. No one touches it. Not even the squire who once ate a candle because he mistook it for a custard. Because here's the thing, vegetables were associated with the poor. And being poor in medieval times wasn't just a socioeconomic state, it was a moral and spiritual concern. Poverty was entangled with sin, divine punishment, and, unfortunately for our friend, the carrot, cabbage, and leek culinary shame, you take a step back from the table, letting the lute music lull your ears, and your eyes wander across the mural on the back wall. It's a painting of the Last Supper, but oddly stylized. No salad there either. So let's dig a little deeper. Pardon the root vegetable pun. What did nobles eat instead of vegetables? Well, meats were the stars of the show, but so were breads, particularly those made from finely sifted white flour. It took a lot of labor to get wheat to behave like that, and labor meant status. Barley and rye were for peasants. White wheat was for those who wore too many rings. Fruit got a pass, especially dried fruit. Raisins were elegant figs, exotic, and dates came with an air of crusader chic. A fig was a fashion statement, a lettuce a red flag. Now here comes your first fun fact of the night. One of the most popular medieval cookbooks, Le Viandier, contains hundreds of recipes. Almost none feature vegetables as stars. They're supporting actors, if present at all. Usually boiled, occasionally minced, always bland. And here comes our first detail. You didn't ask for one 13th century recipe suggested adding rosewater to turnips. Why, no one knows. Some scholars argue it was a desperate attempt to make root vegetables smell less like root. But there's a lingering question in the warm air of the stone hall. Did they really hate vegetables, or was this more complicated than it looks? Welcome to your first scholarly debate of the night. Some historians believe the aversion wasn't to vegetables themselves, but to how they were prepared. Without butter, which wasn't always abundant, without salt, which was sometimes taxed, and without the culinary freedom to experiment, Without suspicion of witchcraft, vegetables simply didn't stand a chance. Still others argue that nobles were conditioned to avoid certain foods to maintain social boundaries. If a dish looked too much like something a farmhand would eat, it had to go. And now, just for pacing, let's give you 3 tiny laughs before we drift on. In one banquet, a nobleman once mistook boiled leeks for his napkin. He wiped his face, gagged, and made his jester eat the rest as penance. The term peasant soup was once used as an insult. Today you'd pay $14 for it in a rustic cafe with reclaimed wood tables. There was a vegetable called skirret that was so ugly it was nicknamed the mole's spaghetti. I'll leave that to your imagination. Back at the table, the feast continues. The nobles laugh, wine flows, and servants clear the plates. The spinach still there, unloved, unbothered, a quiet rebellion in green. Meanwhile, outside the window in the courtyard kitchen, a cook named Allard is peeling turnips with alarming speed. He has dreams of flavor. He's experimenting roasting instead of boiling. Madness. If caught, he might be demoted to chicken plucker. But tonight his turnips are kissed with cloves and a touch of aged vinegar. He tastes one. He smiles. You don't know it yet, but Allard is starting a small revolution. One taste bud at a time. And somewhere deep in the pantry, behind the barrels of salted pork and dusty sacks of wheat, sits a basket of onions. Waiting. Watching. Ready. So you're still here, awake or not, that's between you and your pillow. But let's glide gently onward, still in the glow of candlelight and the wafting scent of roast meat. You've just left behind that lonely spinach leaf, and now you're walking slow and soft into the second course of our story. A story about how vegetables weren't just food, they were symbols. Tonight you stand in a noble courtyard where the kitchens smoke quietly before dawn. Somewhere a rooster crows prematurely, and you, invisible as a shadow, pass beneath stone arches, while servants whisper about deliveries. What's coming isn't just produce, it's class politics in a sack of parsnips. Let's talk about who eats what. In medieval Europe, especially around the 13th and 14th centuries, the plate became more than a plate. It was a canvas, a coded message, a kind of edible resume. You are what you eat. No. You are who you're allowed to eat like. For example, if you are a nobleman, eating a bowl of lentils isn't just a poor life choice. It's a poor person choice, even if they're spiced with saffron and stirred with a golden spoon. Because lentils grow close to the ground. Because they require boiling. Because they are filling and cheap. And if you can afford to not eat lentils, then why on earth would you? Let's pause and imagine a dinner guest, Sir Geoffrey of overcompensation, arriving at your manor. He brings his own pewter spoon and, in an act of outrageous rebellion, declares he wants greens tonight. Gasps. A noble woman faints gently. The steward drops a chicken, and somewhere in the herb garden the sage plant smirks. But why such a strong reaction? Because eating like a peasant was dangerous. Not because it was unsanitary or even unhealthy, but because it blurred lines. The entire feudal system was built like an onion-layered pungent and liable to make you cry. Food was a key part of reinforcing that system. Nobles had access to hunted meat, sugar, imported spices. Peasants had onions, barley, maybe some beans on a good week. So, when nobles dined, they dined performatively. Huge pies with live birds baked inside, glazed peacocks redressed in their own feathers, pastries shaped like castles. Eating vegetables, plain, unseasoned, honest, undermined the whole performance. It was like showing up to a masquerade ball wearing your laundry day tunic. Let's sprinkle in a real historical tidbit here. In some noble households, there was actually a separate servant who tested vegetables to ensure they weren't peasant-washed produce, meaning stolen from commoner plots. Talk about salad security. Now here's your quirky detail for this part. Some nobles hired professional eaters to consume foods on their behalf that were considered too rustic. These eaters were paid to attend feasts, sit quietly at the low table, and eat boiled greens porridge or dark bread, just so the Lord could enjoy the illusion of moral virtue without the unpleasantness of flavorless legumes. Now tell me that isn't peak medieval nonsense. And speaking of illusion, let's peek at the cookbook shelves, those few dusty tomes kept behind lock and key. In these early recipe collections, you'll find vegetable dishes carefully hidden under titles like sauce for meat or base for stew. It's as if the authors themselves were embarrassed to give cabbage its own headline. Let's take a small debate break, shall we? Just a scholarly breeze through the library of food history. Some academics argue that nobles didn't hate vegetables, they just didn't trust them. In times of plague and famine, vegetables were sometimes blamed for bad humors, that medieval catch-all explanation for everything from sadness to sudden sneezing. Eating raw greens, possibly a sign of poor judgment or worse, witchcraft. Yes, lettuce might have had vibes, but others suggest the aversion was strategic. By avoiding poor food, nobles set themselves apart not just in wealth, but in supposed morality. It wasn't about flavor. It was about distance, literal and social, from the dirt. Now, as promised, 3 soft chuckles to keep things cozy. A 14th century noble once banned all cabbage from his castle, not for taste, but because it reminded him of peasant breath. His chef resigned. The cabbage did not comment. A record from a French manor shows a noblewoman ordering fake apples made of dyed bread for a banquet centerpiece. Because fruit is good, but effort even better. In one particularly over-the-top feast, vegetables were carved into miniature knights jousting on a field of mashed turnips. Guests were encouraged to eat the losing knight. We don't talk about the emotional trauma of the parsnip squires. Now, as you drift past another flickering fireplace, you spot a mural on the wall. It's painted with scenes of Eden, not just Adam and Eve, but overflowing with lush greens and ripe fruits. And yet, in the dining hall below, none of that bounty is served. Coincidence. You hear whispers among the kitchen maids. They're gossiping, of course, about a visiting noblewoman who ate a boiled beet. A beet, they hiss, bold, scandalous, earthy. Was she trying to make a point? Was it medical or worse? Did she like it? Let's go deeper. Into the pantry, into the wooden crates stamped with sigils of long-dead dukes. Here lie the dried peas, the wilted herbs, the onions braided like ceremonial cords. No one looks at them, but you do. You see potential. You see comfort food waiting for the right moment in history to shine. And that moment, dear friend, is still centuries away. But not all is gloom for our vegetable friends. In distant corners of noble households, especially among the ladies, monks, and physicians, there are murmurs. Whispers that maybe, just maybe, vegetables aren't the enemy. That perhaps under certain astrological alignments, and with enough saffron, even a turnip might earn its place. We're not quite there yet, but we're on the road. A road paved with carrot peels and cabbage dreams. And at the next feast, when the boar's paraded in on a silver platter, and the pheasant is flambéed mid-dance, someone will ask quietly, almost imperceptibly, "Is there salad?" You don't hear the answer, but you see the look. And in that look is the future of food. And here you are again, still wrapped in the velvet cloak of midnight curiosity, somewhere between sleep and soup. The fire hasn't gone out yet, just like your appetite for stories that simmer gently. And tonight we follow your footsteps further down the long, medieval table. Past the silverware shaped like serpents, past the sweetmeats sculpted into mythical beasts. Now we find ourselves in the kitchen. Yes, the real kitchen. The one the nobles don't show off. Because behind the tapestries, behind the servants' doors, carved just small enough to remind you you're not welcome unless you duck, there's a world of soot and steam, of bone broth and burnt spoons. And here, my dear friend, is where the vegetables live. Tonight you are invisible, still your presence softer than rising yeast. You wander among cauldrons. You eye a sack of turnips. You feel the floor stones still warm from the bread ovens. It smells like wood smoke and thyme, and something slightly scorched, probably on purpose. Hopefully on purpose. This is the territory of the cook. And cooks, unlike nobles, like vegetables. They may not respect them, certainly not, but they know them. Deeply. Like old frenemies. Reliable. Unchanging. Slightly soggy in winter. Let's consider the role of the medieval cook, shall we? These were not chefs in the modern sense. They were often illiterate, underpaid, and overworked. But they held terrifying power. The cook could poison a king or save a knight from scurvy. They were part artist, part logistics manager, part therapist to meats behaving badly. Their job was not just to feed people, it was to impress, to perform, to improvise under pressure using, well, sometimes just onions and hope. This brings us to the medieval kitchen's deepest secret. Vegetables were not eliminated, they were camouflaged. Turnips mashed and dyed to resemble swan meat. Leeks shredded into sauces so sharp you'd never guess they came from dirt. Beans baked into pies where they hid under 12 layers of crust like guilty secrets. You see, the art of medieval cooking was often the art of vegetable disguise. Because nobles demanded grandeur. They wanted roasted unicorns, okay, not literally, well, sometimes literally, but definitely something they could brag about. So the humble cook did what any underappreciated creative would do, they lied. And in their lies, we find flavor. Take the example of the mortreuse, a meat paste often involving pork or chicken, thickened with bread and flavored with, wait for it, onions, leeks, herbs, and spinach. But do they call it a vegetable dish? No, it's a noble meat preparation. The greens are buried like treasure in the consistency of hummus with a college degree. Now let's spice things up with a strange detail. One of the more celebrated dishes in 14th century France was a mock egg. Cooks would take almond milk, blend it with saffron and breadcrumbs, mold it into the shape of an egg yolk, wrap it in sugar paste, then nestle it into a real eggshell. Voila! A vegetarian egg made entirely of not egg. Why? Because some noblemen gave up eggs for Lent, but not illusions. Now we pause as promised for your soft academic debate of the night. Some scholars argue that these vegetable disguises weren't just about class performance, they were a loophole for religious rules. During Lent and other fast days, meat was banned, but nobles still wanted feasts, so cooks made meatless dishes that looked like meat. Others argue this was culinary theater food as illusion, as magic trick, as dinner party prestige. So was the onion merely a side dish or a disguised revolutionary? Let's gently chuckle our way through this mental fog with 3 bedtime-friendly absurdities. A 15th century cookbook includes a recipe for hedgehogs made of rice. The rice is molded into shape stuck with almond slivers for spikes and served with jam. When asked why hedgehogs, the author replied because it pleases guests. Culinary logic. 1. Biology. A nobleman once ordered his cook to make his meal entirely white. The cook served chicken in almond milk, white bread parsnip puree, and bleached wine. When asked about flavor, the nobleman said aesthetics were satisfying. So was the antacid later. One kitchen record shows a feast with apple pies filled with minced fish. No reason is given, just the haunting knowledge that it happened. Now let's pull back for a moment. You're still drifting through this kitchen where cauldrons bubble like ancient secrets. A cook wipes her hands on a linen apron darkened with rosemary stains. She doesn't notice you, but you watch her pick up a leek with something like affection. She doesn't say she likes it, but you know. And here's something curious. In some noble households, records show that cooks secretly kept side pots hidden from view where they simmered their own meals. These were dishes they actually liked. Lentil stews, cabbage with a bit of old bacon, a boiled carrot maybe. Simpler, warmer, more forgiving. These weren't recipes to impress. These were recipes to survive. And through them, vegetables lived on. Quietly, underground you might say. Like actual root vegetables. Waiting for the day the dining hall would remember them. You walk now past a shelf of dry herbs, bay leaf, sage, marjoram. Some used in noble dishes, some saved for secret soups. You pass a bowl of garlic so pungent it clears your sinuses retroactively. You pass a scroll pinned open with a recipe scribbled half in Latin, half in passive aggression. And then finally you pass a note stuck with grease to the wall. It reads in loose script. Even princes get the runs. Cook the leeks well. A proverb, a warning, culinary poetry, all 3. You smile, the cook hums. And in that gentle hum of fire knife and hope the vegetables remain. They may not win tonight, but they will return. Outside, the wind carries the scent of rosemary from a forgotten garden. Somewhere a rooster mutters in its sleep, unsure if it's time yet. But inside, all is still. You find yourself wandering further down this warm, winding corridor of culinary history, the kitchen fading behind you like the last whiff of rosemary in the air. Your steps, soft as sifted flour, take you through the hidden arteries of a medieval manor. Somewhere between the buttery and the brewhouse, you emerge into another space that's not quite a dining room, not quite a pantry, a liminal place where plans are made and menus are judged sometimes by candlelight, sometimes by candle gossip. This is where the steward sits, and he is having an existential crisis over peas. Tonight, your story floats around him like steam from a stew pot. You're invisible, of course, as always. A spectral guest, unnoticed but observant. You perch unseen on a stool older than grammar beside a pile of invoices for eels. Yes, eels. We'll get there. The steward holds a quill, a scroll, and a headache. He is planning the next banquet. He's debating out loud to no one whether a noble feast should include vegetables at all. Because you see, serving vegetables to the upper class is like suggesting a king wear wool. technically possible but socially suicidal. Still, the steward must balance budgets, pander to egos, and appease the cook who is quietly threatening to tender her resignation in the form of a parsnip dagger. So he hesitates, peas or no peas? To answer that, we need to understand, how did medieval society even classify food? At the core of it all, there was humoral theory, a medical model that sounds like a comedy troupe, but is actually a diet plan designed by people with zero sense of flavor and a lot of opinions. The four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, were thought to control everything from your mood to your menu. Food was assigned hot, cold, and wet, dry qualities. Balance your humors, they said, and you'll feel well. Unbalance them, and you might accidentally turn melancholic just from eating an undercooked cabbage. This was serious business. Peas, for example, were considered cold and moist. This made them suspicious. Cold and moist foods were associated with sluggishness and melancholy, a danger to anyone trying to be alert and noble at the same time. And so vegetables weren't just peasant food, they were risky food. That's why meats and breads and spices were popular among the aristocracy. Meats were hot and dry, spices were practically liquid sunshine. Even wine had its humoral merits, but vegetables, the wrong root at the wrong time of year could send your inner balance spinning faster than your Chamberlain could say midsummer flux. Let's lean into something delightful now, the medieval banquet menu. Imagine sitting at a 14-foot-long table under banners and candlelight, surrounded by powdered wigs and questionable footwear. A herald announces the first course. What do you get? Roast peacock served with its feathers reassembled, a porridge made of almond milk and rice, a hedgehog-shaped jelly, and finally a salad of boiled lettuce, possibly with vinegar and pepper. Not a tomato in sight. Tomatoes weren't trusted yet. They were still considered decorative, possibly poisonous, and definitely Spanish, which was apparently 3 strikes. Even potatoes had yet to arrive from the New World. So what vegetables did make it to the table? Leeks, onions, turnips, fennel, cabbage, garlic, parsley, but always cooked and often buried under layers of almond milk, saffron, or breadcrumbs. Raw vegetables were considered dangerous unless they were for the poor or the very brave. Let's pause here gently for your curious culinary trivia of the night. Did you know that the first recorded medieval cookbook in English, the form of curry, compiled around 1390, included a surprising number of vegetable recipes? Things like pottage of herbs, onions, and gravy, and even a dish called peas and almond milk. Why? Because while nobles avoided vegetables, their kitchens didn't. The cooks needed variety, texture, and volume. Vegetables filled bellies and padded roasts. They were the flower between the feathers. Which brings us to your scholarly whisper for tonight. Some historians argue that vegetables were not as rare on noble tables as we often assume. They suggest that the avoidance was symbolic. Vegetables were served but never emphasized. They were background dancers, never the main act. Others say vegetables only appeared during fasting days when meat was forbidden, and even then disguised beyond recognition. So were vegetables common but invisible, or truly absent and shamed? Chew on that gently. Meanwhile, allow me to serve you 3 light snacks of historical humor. A 13th century Italian lord once banned onions from being served at court because he claimed they made people weep too freely and argue with salt. No mention was made about how many arguments were started over who stole the last roasted onion. In a Scottish household record from 1472, there's a note about a cook being scolded for over-cabbaging a feast. He responded by planting an actual cabbage in the Lord's chair. He was demoted, then rehired when the turnips overboiled. A noblewoman once insisted that her cook prepare a pie with no roots, no leaves, no stems, and no seeds. The cook made a flour pie crust filled with perfume. It was declared a triumph of ambition over appetite. Now back in the steward's office, the debate has reached a peak. He mutters, "We could serve the turnips mashed with honey?" No, that's for morning days. He considers carrots, but only the purple ones. Orange hasn't been invented yet, or at least not fashionable. And then he decides peas will be served, but only inside a roast pheasant, like an edible nesting doll. That way, no one sees the vegetable until it's too late. You smile. The peas went around. As you leave the steward to his menus and mental breakdowns, you walk past another room, a quieter one, a chamber reserved for the almoner, the noble in charge of feeding the poor. Here vegetables rule. Simple stews of lentils and cabbage. Porridges made from barley and carrots. No illusions, no saffron, no edible hedgehogs. Just food meant to warm stomachs, not reputations. And you realize something else: while nobles dined in luxury, many of their vegetable dishes trickled down to those in need. But also many recipes trickled up, borrowed, adjusted, refined, and renamed. What began as peasant fare became rustic charm. The noble tongue never wanted to admit it, but somewhere in every parsnip puree was the soul of a common pot. You drift now toward the back gardens where kitchen herbs grow quietly under moonlight. You brush a hand across lavender, thyme, mint. In the silence of night, even the most ignored ingredients seem noble. And out here beyond the feast and fear of peas, vegetables simply are. You're still walking slowly now past herb gardens soaked in moonlight. Somewhere behind you, the steward is wrestling with peas, the cook is threatening a carrot revolution, and the banquet guests are blissfully unaware that their food has been arranged like political propaganda. You, however, are on your way to meet someone who doesn't care about menus or manners. Someone who believes food should be functional, not fashionable. Tonight, you're heading into the apothecary's corner of the estate. You slip into a cramped room that smells like wet parchment, drying sage, and a hint of regret. Wooden shelves creak under the weight of jars filled with questionable substances. Some are labeled powder of sympathy, others just snail water. There's a pot labeled oxymel of squill. You stare at it for a full minute before deciding not to ask. This is the world where food and medicine blur. In fact, in medieval times, they were practically the same thing. Eat the wrong stew, and it's an illness. Eat the right stew, and it's a cure. Tonight, you're going to learn how vegetables became prescriptions and why some nobles feared eating healing food as much as any plague. Let's start with something everyone feared: flatulence. Yes, the medieval upper class had a deeply seated terror of bloating. Not just because it was uncomfortable, though yes, corsets and tight tunics didn't help, but because it was seen as a sign of imbalance, a warning bell that the humors were misaligned. And you know what caused flatulence: beans, peas, cabbage, all the things your modern gut bacteria adore. And so medical guides written for the elite routinely advised caution with legumes and brassicas. There were entire treatises about how to cook lentils in wine to quell their wicked winds. Imagine being so powerful you had a scribe copy a fart-reducing recipe in Latin on gilded vellum. Culinary medicine was layered with superstition. Take garlic, for example. To the peasant, it was food. To the noble, it was suspiciously pungent and socially precarious. To the physician, a powerful treatment for coughs, parasites, and even forgetfulness. But recommending garlic to a noble was like suggesting mouthwash made of vinegar useful, but emotionally traumatic. This tension between nourishment and medicine created a fascinating paradox. The healthiest vegetables were often considered too strong for refined stomachs. Leeks could warm the blood, but they also made the breath savage. Parsnips promoted digestion, but they were considered coarse and rudish. Even spinach had a reputation for cleansing, which was code for "don't eat this" if you have guests coming. But here's where things get really strange. Some nobles did eat vegetables, but only after transforming them into something else. This brings us to your bizarre historical aside of the night. In certain 14th century French courts, carrots were pickled in rose water, dyed with crushed beetles, and served as dessert. Yes, carrot candy. Because if a vegetable pretends to be a jewel, it is suddenly acceptable. And here's your popular historical tidbit to chew on while we digest that image. Charlemagne, yes, that Charlemagne issued orders in the 9th century that imperial estates should grow specific medicinal plants and vegetables. His Capitulare de Villis included things like onions, leeks, coriander, and fennel. The emperor wasn't just a conqueror, he was a garden planner. But fast forward a few centuries and nobles are once again treating vegetables like suspicious cousins. What happened? The Renaissance happened, and with it fashion. Eating became performance. The colors of food, the shapes, the theatricality all mattered more than their nutritional value. A roast goose was not a meal, it was a statement. A boiled carrot, a culinary shrug. Unless that carrot was sculpted into a swan and dyed with saffron. Let's take a gentle pause for your scholarly question of the night. Was this vegetable snobbery a matter of class? Or was it more about power who had the luxury of ignoring health in favor of spectacle? Some scholars argue that medieval nobles rejected vegetables precisely because they didn't need them. Meat, wine, spices, these were expensive. To eat only the rarest foods was to flaunt control. Vegetables were associated with survival, so rejecting them wasn't just dietary, it was ideological. Others say that the rejection was medical conservatism. Nobles were cautious about unfamiliar plants, wary of poisoning, and deeply superstitious. It wasn't snobbery, it was fear. As always, the truth is likely a sautéed mix of both. And now some humor to sprinkle like parsley. In a 15th century English recipe book, there's an instruction to boil the cabbage until it gives up. Scholars assume this meant until it softens, but honestly, same energy. One noble reportedly asked his cook to remove the sullen leaves from his salad. When questioned, he claimed he didn't trust vegetables that seemed to be judging him. A Hungarian physician once wrote that garlic was good for the heart, bad for the conversation. Someone embroidered it on a pillow. Let's change scenes now. You drift through a covered corridor toward the monastery kitchens. Here, monks move quietly, chanting psalms and peeling onions at the same time. Multitasking medieval edition. Monasteries were oddly where vegetables got their moment of glory. Unlike nobles, monks had strict dietary rules, especially during fast days. No meat, no fancy sauces, and so they perfected the art of vegetable cooking. They roasted leeks, stewed lentils, fermented turnips. They made beer from herbs and soup from nettles. In fact, some monasteries were known for their culinary wisdom. They wrote guides not just for fasting, but for flavor. And unlike the courts, monks viewed food not as theater, but as discipline. Every dish had purpose. Every ingredient mattered. But even here, luxury crept in. Over time, wealthy monasteries began importing spices. They started brewing sweet wines, and their vegetables served with almond paste, saffron, and raisins. Even piety has its palate. Still, this was one place where vegetables were not only respected but necessary. Without them, the monks would have perished, or worse, grown bored. So perhaps as you float down this stone hallway, you see the arc more clearly. From medicine to mistrust, from survival to symbolism, from field to feast. Vegetables in the Middle Ages weren't just food, they were metaphors for class, for health, for fear, and for flexibility. They appeared, disappeared, and reappeared on plates, always trailing the scent of caution. And now at the edge of the monastery courtyard, you see something rare, a nobleman sitting quietly chewing on a sprig of parsley. He looks around, checks no one is watching, and dips it in honey. Maybe, just maybe, he's learning that flavor isn't something to fear. And you, with your quiet steps and sleepy eyes, are learning it too. You're still awake barely, but your footsteps are softer now, more dream than stride. You've wandered from the monastery gardens, through kitchens and courts, and now you find yourself in a quieter, more intimate corner of the medieval world, the manor's private chambers, where late-night meals whisper more than they speak. It's here behind thick curtains and under candlelight that the last chapter of tonight's story unfolds. Picture it, a noblewoman in a linen nightgown sitting near a hearth stirring something in a small copper pot. It's not porridge, it's not stew, it's pears, poached in wine, with a clove or two and a sprig of thyme. Because when the rest of the world sleeps, the vegetables sneak back onto the noble table, not as lectures in fiber, but as lullabies. Tonight, you're entering the world of late-night medieval snacks, a tradition less documented, but deeply revealing. These were the quiet meals unsupervised by etiquette, unjudged by feasting halls. These were the moments nobles finally allowed themselves to enjoy the vegetables they mocked at banquets. In private, the rules bent. Leeks were mashed with cheese and wrapped in pastries. Onions were caramelized with honey and laid gently on bread. Carrots were grated into cakes and dusted with cinnamon. None of this was served with fanfare. None of it came with peacock feathers or silver platters. Just comfort, quiet, and the soft sigh of someone who's finally eaten something digestible. And here's your first surprising detail of the night among the elite: digestibility wasn't just a medical concern, it was a social one. If a food made you too sleepy, too gassy, or too moist of temperament, it was banned from daytime meals. But by night, all bets were off. Your stomach, like your reputation, could rest. Even better, some nobles kept personal recipe books, tiny things bound in leather full of midnight dishes. Many were passed down in families, annotated with little notes like, "Mother's good leek tart, do not overbake," or "Father liked this only without the chard." It's a softer side of history, one not found in great feasts or battlefield journals, but in crumbs. Of course, not all late-night eats were vegetable-based. Some nobles kept sweetened almonds under their pillows. Others requested bowls of barley broth laced with fennel seeds. Still, more than one chambermaid was tasked with secretly brewing nettle tea at midnight. These meals weren't about status, they were about sleep. And speaking of sleep, let's sprinkle in 3 light jokes for the path ahead. A nobleman once claimed beets made him weep with joy. His physician later discovered he was just allergic to them. A lady of the court allegedly rejected all vegetables unless they had been knighted with butter. Historians are still unsure if she meant that literally. One monk recorded a dream in which he was pursued by a talking turnip. He fasted from root vegetables for a week. Now, for your common historical truth, peasants often ate far more vegetables than nobles, not by choice, but necessity. Their diets were rich in cabbages, onions, garlic beans, and lentils. While nobles dined on roasted swan, the poor were perfecting leek and barley stews that modern nutritionists would envy. And here's your unusual little side fact. In 14th century Italy, some physicians believed that eating too much lettuce at night would give you melancholy dreams. So they recommended pairing it with warm spices and honey. The first medieval sleep aid. Possibly. You lean back now, the fire crackling beside you. Your host, an aging countess with sharp eyes and soft slippers, offers you something. A cup of soup. Pale green, warm, smells faintly of sorrel and milk. This, she says, is the only thing I trust when the moon is high and my thoughts are restless. You sip. It tastes like patience, like soft leaves in distant rain. And maybe you understand why vegetables so mistrusted by day become companions by night. Because here's the scholarly question to end the evening. Did medieval nobles truly hate vegetables, or did they just fear what vegetables represented? Simplicity, humility, vulnerability. To eat a carrot is to admit you're mortal. To enjoy cabbage soup is to admit you're hungry, not just for power or status, but for comfort. And perhaps that was the most terrifying truth of all. So as you rise slowly now, ready to leave this sleepy world behind, you look one last time at the quiet table. There's a bowl of stewed lentils, some roasted turnips, a leek pie half finished, and somewhere in the shadows a noble sneaks back for one more bite. You smile, because now you know in the still of night, even the proudest forget to be proud. They just eat, and sleep, and dream. The fire is down to embers now. You've wandered through stone halls, candlelit kitchens, whispered recipes, and nervous nobles afraid of beans. You've tasted suspicion ceremony and the occasional poached pear. But more than that, you've uncovered something gentle, a history that breathes, that laughs, that forgets its manners when no one's watching. And that's the real gift of stories like these, not just what they tell you, but what they let you feel. So wherever you are tonight, whether wrapped in blankets or blinking at the ceiling, I hope this tale brought you closer to the kind of rest only honesty allows. The kind found in quiet corners and warm bowls. The kind that reminds you it's okay to not be grand all the time. Even kings need soup. So close your eyes, breathe deep. Let the peasants plant, the nobles fret, and the onions simmer. History will still be here tomorrow, but tonight it's just you, the silence, and the gentle hum of forgotten kitchens. That's the story for tonight. May your dreams be filled with wonder and peace. Hey friends, tonight let's explore something green, humble, and surprisingly controversial. You're not in a battlefield. You're not in a grand hall. You're standing in a medieval vegetable patch. There's a turnip that looks like it's seen things. A cabbage so wiry it could fight back. Somewhere nearby, a peasant is trying to decide whether this is lunch or next spring seed. And far, far away, behind stone walls and velvet curtains, a nobleman crinkles his nose. He is not amused by peas. He has opinions about onions. So before you relax, take a second to like and subscribe if you find value in what we share. And hey, if you're tuning in from somewhere leafy or leafy adjacent, let me know where and what time it is in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The wind smells of hay, garlic, and something recently unearthed. You walk through a village kitchen garden, dense rows of leek parsnip and spring greens. The plants are modest, determined. Not one of them is glamorous. But here in the early medieval world, this scraggly rectangle of soil is survival. And if you think vegetables were loved for their charm or flavor, let's just say that's a modern illusion. In the Middle Ages, vegetables were not romantic. They were not honored. They were tolerated like mud on boots or your cousin who talks to sheep. Worry you why? Because vegetables meant poverty. You see, in medieval class culture, food was code. You didn't just eat, it was a performance. And if your bowl held cabbage and not meat, you might as well have confessed to being unimportant. Peasants boiled turnips because they had to. Nobles avoided them because they could. And so vegetables became what you ate when there was nothing left to hunt nothing left to buy, and no feast to attend. And let's face it, turnip soup never looks good in a tapestry. Now here's your first historical fact to chew on. Most peasants ate vegetable pottage twice a day every day for most of their lives. It was often made from whatever was available: leeks beans, wild herbs, and sometimes, luxury alert, a knuckle of old bacon. The result, a nutritious, lumpy, unphotogenic stew. The Instagram of the medieval world would have wept. The rich, on the other hand, treated vegetables like disappointing guests at a party. They were there, sure, but no one was excited. You reach the kitchen of a small manor house. The cook is slicing parsnips, scowling. Not because she dislikes vegetables, she's just been ordered to make a meatless meal for the lower-ranking servants. They'll survive, she mutters, adding salt like she's personally offended by roots. And she's not alone. In many noble households, vegetables were reserved for those who needed them, which is polite medieval for people who weren't important enough for pork. And oh, the noble scorn, one chronicler wrote that cabbage was for monks' onions, for farmers, and garlic for the French, which in context was not a compliment. Let's pause for a gentle joke break, shall we? What did the medieval nobles say to the salad, "You're beneath me"? Literally, you grow in the dirt. Why did the onion cry it realized it was born into the wrong social class? What's a peasant's favorite romantic gesture? Sharing the last parsnip in the pot. But vegetables had one tiny inconvenient advantage: they kept people alive. So while nobles turned up their noses, they still stocked turnips in times of war, still forced their cooks to boil carrots when game ran low, still grudgingly ate leek on lean days. And this brings us to a curious detail. Some noble diets became so meat-heavy that they caused digestion scandals. Chroniclers complained about bloated dukes, constipated counts, and one bishop whose stomach rebelled like a siege. Medieval physicians actually prescribed boiled vegetables to rich patients quietly in shame. Imagine being told by your doctor, "My lord, your insides require cabbage." The horror. You drift into the hall of a small noble estate. There's a banquet, silver plates, roasted birds, no greens, none. The only herbs in sight are decorative. Suddenly, someone sneezes. A monk nearby whispers, "Should have had a beetroot," but he says it like a threat. Now let's open our first academic debate. Was vegetable avoidance about status or about humoral medicine? According to humoral theory dominant in medieval Europe, foods had temperaments: hot, cold, wet, dry. Meat was hot and dry, masculine, energizing. Vegetables cold and wet, feminine, passive, potentially weakening. So nobles weren't just snubbing peasants. They were protecting their internal balance, or so they thought. But was that medical belief a cover for snobbery? Did class shape science, or did science excuse classism? You decide quietly as you sip your imaginary lentil tea. Outside, a boy with a wooden bowl kneels by the fire. His pottage simmers. He's humming. A carrot floats up like a small orange miracle. And back in the noble hall, the lord orders more pheasant. No one mentions the cabbage patch just beyond the window. That would be gauche. So what does a nobleman eat exactly? You walk with him now. He's dressed in wool, not touching the ground. His shoes cost more than a pig. He's heading to breakfast, well, his version of breakfast. A little roast capon, some white bread, maybe a wine-poached pear. Not a spinach leaf in sight, because spinach is wet, and wet things make people sluggish. That's what the physician says, and the nobleman agrees, mostly because he never liked the color green anyway. But truth be told, he's hungry between meals, and the cooks know it. So late at night when the curtains are drawn and no one's watching, someone brings him a bowl of leek and barley. He pretends it's a broth. It's not, it's vegetables. But shh, this is a secret meal, a shameful pleasure. Let's step into a peasant's hut now. The walls are wattle and daub. The ceiling is smoke blackened. There's one pot. In it, turnip greens, barley, a bit of garlic, and a beetroot so misshapen it could be considered art. And it smells divine. Because when all you have is roots, you learn to season like a wizard. A pinch of mustard seed, a dash of vinegar, dandelion leaves for bitterness, and patience, the best medieval spice of all. You eat slowly, hunched near the fire. The warmth is from the food and from the relief of having food. And while nobles dine in glory, peasants dine in peace, chewing the story of the earth itself. Now here's a tiny contradiction: nobles grew vegetables. Not just any vegetables, fancy vegetables. Rare onions, white carrots, even herbs with foreign names like parsley or savory. But they didn't grow them for eating. Not really. They grew them for display. Monastic gardens. Yes, they were practical. but noble gardens. They were full of the status symbol plants, things exotic enough to impress, but humble enough to ignore at the table. It's like buying a piano you never play. You just want your guests to know you could. And yet vegetables had power, real stubborn nutritional power. During famines when bread failed and livestock vanished, guess who stepped up? Cabbage, beans, turnips, even nettles. Yes, nettles, the stinging kind. Peasants boiled them into soup, added wild sorrel, and called it dinner. It was bitter green and undeniably food. Meanwhile, nobles panicked. Their stores ran out. Their pride prevented them from eating weeds. And suddenly, being able to stomach a nettle was a survival skill. One chronicler even describes a noblewoman forced to eat radishes during a siege. She called it a punishment from heaven. Her cook called it Tuesday. Joke break, what's a noble's least favorite soup, whatever the peasants are making? Why did the noble faint in the herb garden? He thought parsley was a poor person. How do you offend a duke at dinner? Ask if he wants a side of carrots. Let's talk peas. Peas were complicated. They were cheap filling and grew easily. Peasants loved them. Nobles tolerated them as long as they were dried, ground into flour, or hidden under spices. One recipe suggests boiling peas 3 times to remove the earthiness. That's a whole relationship. And let's not forget lentils, the legume of judgment. Lentils were barely acceptable in high society, and only on Fridays. Why Fridays? Because of fasting. And even then, they had to be dressed up with almonds or saffron like peas trying to sneak into a wedding. Now here's our second historical detail worth whispering about. The word vegetable barely appears in noble cookbooks before the 14th century. It's not that the vegetables weren't there, they just weren't mentioned. They were background actors in the meat opera, quiet leafy extras. Most recipes focused on birds, beasts, pastries, and sauces. Vegetables were added in phrases like a handful of herbs or greens if need be. Translation, if we're desperate, but let's not be too harsh. Not all nobles hated all vegetables. Some had culinary curiosity, especially in Italy and southern France. Their access to spice roots and Mediterranean diets made vegetables slightly less shameful. A Florentine noble might enjoy artichoke. A Burgundian knight might admit to liking asparagus privately. And as trade increased, vegetables got fashionable slowly. Tomatoes, for example, didn't arrive in Europe until the 16th century. And even then, nobles stared at them like they were poisonous, which they thought they were, because red and juicy equals danger in the medieval imagination, especially if it came from the New World. Let's visit a market stall. The vendor is sunburned, surrounded by baskets of green things. Charred fennel leeks, broad beans, scallions. He shouts in 3 languages, none of them polite. You browse. A woman next to you holds up a wilted cabbage like she's considering a marriage proposal. The man selling it says, best eaten boiled. Or buried. You buy 2. Because even if you're a little fancy, you're not above a good stew. Especially with barley, especially with garlic, especially on a cold morning, which was most mornings. Here's our second open-ended debate. Did vegetable bias reinforce class divisions, or did class create vegetable bias? In other words, did the noble dislike of vegetables cause peasants to rely on them, or did the peasant reliance make nobles see them as less than, it's a chicken and egg question, or perhaps a cabbage and leek one? Some scholars argue that class taste shaped food. Others think food availability defined class. Either way, vegetables were caught in the middle like polite guests at a very awkward party. You rest beside a fire now. A pot simmers. The smell of carrot dill and something vaguely herbal wafts up. It's not fancy. It won't be sung about by minstrels. But it's hot. It's nourishing. It's the same kind of meal a million medieval hands have stirred. And that makes it royal in its own way. Because vegetables, no matter how snubbed, fed the world. Quietly, consistently, reluctantly respected. And in the end, that's what matters most in the dark, hungry stretches of history. One last whisper of truth. Some nobles died of overeating goose. No one ever died from too much cabbage. Well, unless they were being very, very dramatic about it. You wake up to the scent of mint. It's sharp, clean, and unapologetically green. Not a feast smell. Not even a food smell. It's the smell of medicine. And that tells you exactly where you are now. You're in a medieval garden, but not the kind with topiary lines and decorative fountains. This is a herb garden behind a monastery tended by hands that know how to bless and bruise leaves in equal measure. Because in this world, vegetables don't belong in kitchens. They belong in apothecaries. Monastic gardens are quiet, measured things. Long rows, raised beds, earth raked like manuscript margins. Thyme, sage, lavender rue. Some cabbage, but only for poultices. Some leeks, but only for broth on fast days. Some fennel, but only if someone's got gas. You follow a friar with ink-stained fingers. He stops by a patch of marigold, says nothing, then gestures to a bench. Sit. It's good for digestion, he says. You wonder if he means the marigold or the bench. Either way, you sit. Here's your first historical fact for this part. In the Middle Ages, most vegetable growing spaces in noble and religious settings were labeled as physic gardens, not kitchens. That means the leeks were cataloged as remedies. The parsley was medicinal. The celery good for melancholy and excess humors, apparently. They were not food, or at least not just food. They were healing instruments, botanical band-aids. The monks knew this. The nuns definitely knew this. And if you had a fever, you'd be lucky if someone mashed a turnip and put it on your forehead. This created a strange divide. If you ate vegetables casually, you were poor. If you used them medicinally, you were wise. It wasn't about the plant. It was about the context. A carrot in a pottage poverty. A carrot in a syrup for dry throat wisdom. An onion on your plate, questionable. An onion sliced and applied to your feet for heat extraction genius. That's medieval logic for you. Step into a noble lady's solar now. The air is warm, sweet with lavender from a sachet hung by the window. On a table, a small mortar and pestle, crushed basil leaves, chamomile, a single shallot. The lady wears gloves but removes them to mix something with honey. It's not lunch. It's a sore throat cure. She applies it with a silver spoon, not because it helps, but because it feels right, like velvet on a wound. She calls it vegetal refinement. You call it a glorified salad dressing. But no one eats it, not on purpose. Let's pause for our first joke trio of this part medieval medicine, where cabbage is for bruises and bruises are from refusing cabbage. Take 2 leeks and call me in the morning. Said no noble physician ever, but probably should have. If parsley cured headaches, medieval kitchens were basically hospitals with bad bread. Back in the garden, a boy is digging in the dirt. He's tasked with harvesting wormwood, for what no one's really sure. It's bitter. It probably works. It's labeled, do not eat unless dying. You ask him what he wants to grow. Apples, he says. Or something nice, something you can chew without praying first. But apples are fruit, and fruit is complicated. More on that later. Let's talk lettuce. It's mild, innocent looking, harmless. So harmless, in fact, that it was used as a sleep aid. Physicians prescribed cold lettuce infusions to calm hot-headed nobles and melt excessive passions. Which begs the question, how angry did you have to be for a lettuce bath to seem reasonable? And yet, while vegetables thrived in monastic gardens, they rarely crossed the threshold into noble prestige. Why? Because of humor theory. In medieval medicine, the human body was ruled by 4 humors: blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Each food affected these humors. Food was about balance. Vegetables almost all cold and wet. Cold and wet things were for hot and dry people. But no one wanted to be hot and dry. So vegetables were like mood-correcting tools. You didn't eat spinach because you were hungry. You ate it because you were imbalanced. How charming. And this brings us to your second strange fact. Leeks were considered noble only if cooked with milk, honey, and a dash of cinnamon. Yes, really. Dress it up and a leek became a warm, balanced, gently spiced comfort food. Strip it down to boiled in water, and suddenly it was food for monks and muddy farmers. Same plant, different vibe. Let's pivot to the academic debate of this part. Did the medicinal framing of vegetables help preserve them in elite culture or delay their acceptance as everyday food? Some scholars say labeling vegetables as remedies gave them a safe space in noble households. They didn't threaten class structure if used only for health. Others argue this kept vegetables in a kind of culinary exile. They weren't considered food. They were almost food, like backup dancers to the roasted swan, and so they never got to shine until much later. What do you think is medicinal acceptance better than culinary silence? As the sun lowers in the garden, you hear bells from the chapel. A nun kneels by the rosemary. She's not praying to the rosemary, but she does thank it. It helps with memory and stomach cramps and sometimes sorrow. You kneel too, not to pray, to smell. Because in this moment, the garden is soft, holy, and oddly forgiving. And for the first time, you realize something. Maybe vegetables were never meant to impress. Maybe they were meant to tend. You return to the manor that evening. The Lord is tired. The cook offers broth. Does it have herbs, he asks. She nods. Then I'll take wine instead. Some things never change. You walk into a hall where no one is hungry, and yet there's food everywhere. Towering pies, roast fowl with gilded beaks, bread sculptures in the shape of castles, a swan not cooked just posed with gold leaf on its feathers, and a regrettably smug expression. This you realize is not a meal. It's a statement, because in the medieval world, eating was never just about eating. It was about performance. What you served, how you served it, who served it to you, whether the chicken came pre-sliced or still clucking. And the quiet rule underneath it all, never look like you're poor, even if you're starving, especially if you're eating vegetables. You sit beside a young noble. She wears brocade. Her sleeves could conceal small furniture. You see her glance at a bowl of beans. She doesn't reach for them. Instead, she picks at a quail leg, drops it, reaches for white bread, then stops. Not because she's full, because someone is watching. Here's your first historical truth this round. Feasting in medieval courts was a public political act. Every dish said something about your wealth, your alliances, your morals, even your theology. To serve vegetables unadorned was to say, I am simple, I am modest. I cannot afford meat, I forgot what a kitchen is. None of those were useful things to say if you were trying to marry your daughter to a duke. So vegetables had to disguise themselves. Carrots were baked into tarts, spinach was hidden in cheese, peas were mashed, sieved, dyed, and turned into pudding. Only then were they permitted on the high table. Even your greens had to wear costume. Let's stroll into a lower hall. Same castle, different rules. The steward eats cabbage with mustard. The chambermaid spoons up lentil stew. The footman cradles a slice of rye bread topped with onions and... Is that lard? You ask him if it's good. He shrugs. Better than feathers. Fair enough. Back upstairs, things are tense. Not because of war, or taxes, or plague, but because the Lord has asked for soup. And the kitchen only has onions. The cook panics, adds almonds, adds cloves, adds a sprinkle of saffron so small it could qualify as a rumor. By the time the soup reaches the Lord, it's golden sweet exotic. He says, ah, luxury. It's an onion. But no one tells him that. Joke time. If a noble eats a vegetable and no one sees it, does it still lower their status? Medieval kitchen motto, add spice until it no longer tastes like cabbage. Nobility's biggest fear, accidentally enjoying peasant food. Let's talk about plates. You weren't just judged by what was on your plate. You were judged by whether you had a real plate. Poor folks ate off bread trenchers. Rich folks ate off pewter. Kings ate off gold. But if a nobleman ate stew off a trencher, scandal. Even if it was the same stew, even if it was better stew, presentation was everything. And vegetables, unfortunately, presented poorly. They didn't stack. They didn't shine. They didn't ripple with fat or glisten with sauce. They wilted, they steamed, they leaked. And worst of all, they looked humble. Here's a weird little truth. Some nobles would stage fast days just to display their culinary restraint, then secretly feast behind closed doors. They'd serve thin leek soup to guests and roast eel in the back kitchen. They'd eat vegetable stews in public and meat pies in private. Because pretending to be modest was a trend, but actually eating vegetables, still too risky. Now, the academic question for this chapter, was the rejection of vegetables rooted in taste or status signaling? Some historians suggest nobles had genuine dislike for the earthy, bitter flavors of wild greens. Others say the issue wasn't the taste, it was what the taste meant. That it tasted like not having options. And that made it socially dangerous. After all, it's hard to prove your superiority when you're chewing the same soup as your shepherd. Flash to a wedding feast. The bride is pale, the groom is richer than geography. Tables are groaning, duck, lamb, fish and jelly, and one small dish of roasted parsnips with honey glaze. No one touches it. But later in the side kitchen, the cook scoops it onto a crust of old bread and eats it with closed eyes. It's perfect. It's just not fashionable. Let's follow a scribe now. He records household expenses, ink smudged, sore-eyed, underpaid. He notices that vegetables are often listed without price. They were gathered, someone says. They're not worth documenting, but they are worth eating. And the scribe writes a tiny note in the margin. Don't forget the leeks. You remember him? Because centuries later, it's his voice that tells you who actually kept people fed. In the end, what vegetables lacked in spectacle, they made up for in persistence. They were always there, in garden plots, in roadside pots, in the hollow stomachs of those too tired to perform. They didn't need a title or a table or an audience. They just needed heat and time and maybe a bit of garlic. Tonight you eat a bowl of lentils. You don't decorate it, you don't pretend it's something else. You just eat, because dignity is overrated when you're hungry. And honestly, the stew slaps. You kneel in a small stone chapel. There's no feast here, just silence. Dust motes and sunbeams, a candle trying its best. A monk walks past, nods. He's carrying a bowl, inside lentils, with garlic. You're not sure if it's food or punishment, and that's the moment you realize in the medieval world, vegetables weren't just food. They were morality. Not the fun kind of morality. Not the kind with parties and poetry. The quiet, shaming, guilt-laced kind. The kind that watches you while you chew. Here's your first historical truth of the night. Vegetables were deeply linked to moral virtue in medieval Christian doctrine, especially during fasting seasons. But not in a celebratory way. More like you eat cabbage because you're impure, or eat roots to suffer like Christ, or if it tastes good, you're doing it wrong. Yum. Let's enter Lent. 40 days of self-denial, no meat, no dairy, no eggs, just grains, water, maybe vegetables if you must. But even then there are rules. Boiled leeks, acceptable. Fried leeks, sinful. Onions in broth, holy. Onions with butter, hellish. Why? Because pleasure, or weakness. And vegetables being simple and of the earth became perfect symbols of humility, restraint, and inner cleanliness. They were edible sermons. You visit a monastery kitchen. A monk stirs a pot with the dedication of someone hoping it will taste like anything. You ask what it is. Carrot stew, he whispers. Then after a pause again. You both sigh, but no one complains. Because here complaints are a form of pride, and pride is a sin. In noble households, it wasn't much different, at least during Lent. Even the king had to pretend. Meatless Fridays, vegetable broths, oyster pies that pretended to be ethical, almond milk pretending to be cream. It was all theater. But the message was clear: if you want to be good, you must suffer. And if vegetables are suffering, then congratulations. You're on the righteous path. Let's laugh a little, shall we? Joke break. Medieval dieting tip: want to feel holy? Just eat boiled celery and cry. Confess your sins, eat your leeks, repeat. They said cleanse your soul. So I ate cabbage for 40 days and nearly met God. But here's where it gets twisty. Because too much vegetable eating, that could be suspicious too. Some clerics warned against excessive fasting, said it led to vanity, or worse, smugness. A person who enjoyed their lentil stew might be dangerously close to heresy. So the food had to be just bad enough, not deadly, not indulgent, just bland enough to keep you humble. Here's your second strange fact tonight. There were entire treatises devoted to which vegetables were spiritually safer. Peas, okay. Leeks, good for humility. Garlic only if you weren't planning to speak to anyone for a week. Onions, debatable. Some believed their layers represented moral introspection. Others thought they made people too gassy to pray effectively. Theologians were nothing if not thorough. Now for our academic question, did religious attitudes toward food create a long-term distrust of vegetable pleasure? Some scholars argue yes, that centuries of associating vegetables with denial and humility made them emotionally unattractive even when cooked well. Others say no, that religion simply gave vegetables a place in elite diets without threatening social order. After all, if you only ate them to suffer, no one would think you were poor. So maybe vegetables were spiritually useful because they were socially neutral. A perfect balancing act. Let's walk through a village during Lent. No meat at the market. No fish unless salted. No cheese. A boy sells radishes from a basket. You ask how much. He says one prayer. You think he's joking. He's not. In this town, everything is spiritual right now. Even root vegetables. You buy two, just in case. Inside a cottage, an old woman prepares her meal. Carrot, onion, barley. Nothing more. But she adds thyme. Not because it's allowed, because she misses taste. She closes the shutters, says a quiet apology to God, and sprinkles it in. You don't tell, because survival is sometimes more righteous than purity. And here's a quiet little ending for this part. After Lent, after the fast, after the silence, there's a feast, roast meats, custards, ale. And on the far side of the table, forgotten, is a little pot of leftover cabbage. No one touches it, except you. And it's not bad. It tastes like effort, like patience, like someone trying. It tastes like a lesson. But you've had enough of those for one night. It's late, too late for servants, too late for ceremony. The great hall is quiet. The hearth flickers low. The nobleman sits alone, cloak around his shoulders, spoon in hand. And in front of him, not roast goose, not spiced wine, not anything with gold on it. It's pea soup, simple, hot, green. He doesn't want anyone to know, because in this moment he is not performing. He's just a man who's hungry and tired, and maybe a little in love with lentils. That's your secret tonight. Nobles did eat vegetables, but they did it in secret, in silence, off script. It wasn't just about taste, it was about shame. Shame that came from centuries of association. Vegetables meant lack, meant illness, meant humility. And none of those were fashionable traits in a castle. But the human body doesn't care about fashion. It wants soup. Here's your first historical fact of the night. Private household records like shopping lists and kitchen accounts often show far more vegetable consumption than noble cookbooks suggest. Carrots, parsnips, cabbage, onions by the bushel. They were there. Bought, stored, cooked, but rarely celebrated. Because if you were rich, you ate them privately, quietly, like an embarrassing habit, like singing in the bath. Let's meet a duchess. You find her in her chamber, not asleep, not praying, but stirring something in a small pot over coals. "I miss my mother's stew," she murmurs. She drops in sliced leeks, dried mushrooms, a bit of barley. "This isn't for feast," she says. "This is for remembering." You watch her taste it, and for a moment she looks less like a duchess, more like someone who grew up next to a garden and hasn't told anyone since. Even kings had their secrets. One English monarch, never named directly of course, was rumored to enjoy beet soup before battles. Not because it made him strong, because it reminded him of peace. No cooks, no fanfare, just him, a bowl, and a beet that had no idea it was being politically dangerous. Let's pause for a few gentle laughs. Your Grace, dinner is served. Is it discreetly seasoned lentils? No, it's swan again. Then I'm not hungry. Medieval nobles had three great fears: assassination, bankruptcy, being caught eating cabbage. She wore pearls, he wore velvet. But at 2 a.m., they both ate garlic soup in socks. Let's peek at a pantry. Behind the jugs of wine and wheels of cheese, tucked in a wooden bin, are parsnips. They're not labeled, but they're used in midnight meals, sick room broths, boredom stews, sometimes even in pies under layers of spice so thick no one can tell it's a vegetable. You can almost hear the cook whisper, "Shh, just don't tell the Baron." Now here's your second quirky fact. One noble household employed a cook whose sole job was vegetable transformation. He didn't serve vegetables plainly. He turned carrots into golden threads. He shaped peas into little cakes. He mashed leeks with almonds and honey and served them as pâté of the garden. The goal: make them unrecognizable. Then nobles could eat them, no shame, no guilt, just plausible deniability. Let's open tonight's academic debate. Were these secret vegetable habits signs of personal taste or quiet rebellion? Some say nobles genuinely liked the flavors, but were trapped by social norms. Others suggest these secret meals were acts of emotional memory, of remembering childhood illness recovery. Still others argue it was guilt, a way of engaging with the food of the poor without fully embracing it. Whatever the reason, it was private, and that privacy tells you everything. Let's walk into a castle scullery late. The fire is dying, the servants are gone. You find a young knight, half-armored, spooning turnip soup from a copper pot. He sees you. You expect embarrassment, but he says, "Want some?" and you do, because it's hot, and it's honest, and for once, no one's pretending. You return to your cot, full, quiet, and you wonder how many nobles lay in beds like yours, bellies warm, with vegetable broth, souls soothed by silence. How many peasants cooked for them, knew the truth, and never said a word? There's comfort in secrets shared with the night, even if it's just over a bowl of cabbage stew. You wake to birdsong, real birds, not the sculpted kind perched on pastries. Outside, the fields are green, the market is noisy, and the kitchen smells like roasted beets. Something has changed. You feel it in the bread. You hear it in the way the cook hums, You see it in the bowl of fresh herbs now proudly sitting on the center table, not hidden, not disguised, but glowing in the sun like it's always belonged there. Welcome to the beginning of the vegetable comeback. Here's your first truth for this final chapter. By the late medieval and early modern period, vegetables slowly began reclaiming space at noble tables, especially as trade medicine and philosophy shifted. The age of exploration brought new plants: tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, beans. Not all were trusted. Many were feared. But curiosity began to win. And with that curiosity came a reevaluation of all vegetables, even cabbage. In Italy, the Renaissance poets wrote about salad. In France, cookbooks began mentioning peas with pride. In England, noblewomen grew kitchen gardens on purpose, not for humility, but for flavor. And somewhere in Flanders, a merchant knight ordered a whole banquet themed around the bounty of the earth. It featured 10 dishes. 7 were vegetables. He was laughed at, but also copied. Let's meet a philosopher now. She sits at a table with parchment and a plate of roasted carrots. Virtue, she writes, begins in digestion. She isn't joking. She believes that the body and the soul are linked, and that good food, real food, simple food helps you think better. You watch her bite a radish. She nods. Sharp, honest, useful. You smile. Because a few centuries ago, that same radish would have been a punchline. Now it's a thesis. Joke break peas, once lowly, now philosophical. Beetroot at a banquet bowl. Eat your greens, she said. They're trending now. Let's talk aesthetics. The elite finally discovered what peasants always knew: vegetables are beautiful. Rainbow chard, striped beets, purple carrots, tiny golden tomatoes. Artists painted them. Cooks layered them in pies. Apothecaries sold them as cures and curiosities. Even the humble onion got invited to the art party. Peasant food had become fashionable, which in medieval terms means expensive. Oh, the irony. Here's your final quirky truth. One 16th century noble banquet included a salad carved into the shape of a cathedral, complete with spinach spires and carrot gargoyles. It wasn't for eating, it was a conversation piece. Because now vegetables weren't just tolerated, they were celebrated, even if they had to pretend to be architecture first. And now our last academic debate: was the rise of vegetables in elite culture a genuine change, or just another trend? Some scholars say yes, it reflected a new respect for earth health in simplicity. Others say no, it was fashion, nothing more. A way to feel virtuous without actually changing class dynamics. And maybe both are true. Maybe vegetables got the last laugh by being both common and rare, humble and powerful, quiet and revolutionary. You'll decide in your own time. It's evening now, the fire is low. The nobleman pours broth into a ceramic bowl. His daughter picks basil from the garden. The cook serves roasted squash with herbs. No one hides it. No one apologizes. Even the cat gets a carrot. And you dip your bread into a soup that tastes like earth and garlic and warmth. And you feel good, because vegetables, after centuries of rejection, suspicion, and disguise, have come home. To every table, to every story, to your bowl.